The night swallowed Moscow whole. It was September 13, 1971, 2 days after the official announcement, 3 days after the death. And the city was asleep, or pretending to be. Along the stone pathways of Novodevichy Cemetery, the shadows moved in a way that shadows should not, deliberate, organized, equipped with cameras and earpieces. Men in gray coats stood at intervals between the birch trees, their breath visible in the cool autumn air, their eyes scanning the perimeter with the practiced indifference of professionals. These were not mourners, these were sentinels. And what they were guarding, or rather, what they were containing, was the burial of a man who had once held the fate of the entire planet in his hands. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, former premier of the Soviet Union, former first secretary of the Communist Party, the man who had pounded his shoe on a desk at the United Nations and told the Western world that history would bury it. This man was now being lowered into the frozen Moscow earth without a single military salute, without a single wreath from the state, without a single word broadcast on Soviet television. The announcement of his death had not been made until the hour of his wake, as if even the news of his passing was something to be rationed, controlled, squeezed through the narrowest possible aperture before it could escape into the world. No more than 30 people stood at that graveside. Count them if you can, through the grainy photographs that survived. The ones that were not confiscated. 30 people for a man who had commanded 300 million. The family was there, of course. His widow, Nina Petrovna, standing very still, her hands clasped at her waist, with the rigid composure of someone who has been told, explicitly and more than once, to be careful. Not careful in the ordinary sense, careful in the Soviet sense, which meant something closer to invisible. Her grief was present but compressed, folded inward, because the men with cameras were photographing everyone, and an outburst of emotion in the wrong direction might mean a conversation later in an office with a man behind a desk. Her children understood this. They had been prepared. Beyond the family, a scattering of intellectuals and artists had found their way through. A handful of Moscow's intelligentsia who knew what this moment meant even if the country did not. But even they moved quietly, spoke in whispers, kept their faces arranged in careful neutrality. The KGB agents noted each of them. The cameras clicked. This is where our investigation begins, not with documents, not with archives, not with the dry language of declassified reports, but with this image, this single frame from the cinema of history. A former leader of a nuclear superpower being buried in secret, in darkness, by a government so frightened of him that it could not even let him die in peace. Ask yourself the question that every journalist, every historian, every ordinary person who has ever heard this story eventually asks why. He was 77 years old. He had been stripped of every title, every privilege, every platform since his ouster in October of 1964. That bloodless palace coup organized by Leonid Brezhnev and his allies. The moment when the Kremlin decided that Khrushchev's era of reform and unpredictability had finally gone too far. For 7 years since then, he had lived in enforced obscurity, monitored constantly by the KGB, confined to a government dacha 20 miles outside Moscow, cut off from power as completely as it was possible to cut off a man who still breathed and still remembered. He was, by any political measure, finished, neutralized, a relic. And yet, the security apparatus deployed around Novodevichy Cemetery on the night of his burial was not the security apparatus of a government burying a harmless old pensioner. It was the security apparatus of a government managing a crisis. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac insufficiency, a heart attack, the Soviet state's preferred explanation for inconvenient deaths among inconvenient people. The announcement, distributed through TASS in the cold, bureaucratic language of an institution performing a duty it resented, described his passing with the minimum possible words. No eulogy, no tribute, no acknowledgement of what he had been or what he had done. The Central Committee and the Council of Ministers announced, as the archive dispatch records, simply that he had died, as if saying his name too many times might itself be dangerous. But here's where the story fractures from its official casing. Family members and those close to the household have described in accounts that trickled out over the following years, and then more openly after the glasnost era loosened the archives, that Khrushchev in the week before his death had been in reasonable spirits, not the vigorous shoe-pounding Khrushchev of the 1950s. That man had been worn down by years of isolation and surveillance, but not a dying man either. Not a man whose heart was about to fail. The deterioration, when it came, was sharp and sudden and dramatic in its speed. A morning of relative normalcy, and then by evening, a cascade. A medical team arrived from a special hospital, not his regular physicians, but unfamiliar faces. The family was not admitted to the intensive care unit. By the time they could reach him, there was nothing left to reach. The Soviet government declined the family's request to bury him at the Kremlin wall, the traditional resting place for honored Soviet leaders, and instead designated Novodevichy Cemetery, which, while a prestigious burial ground, carried in this context the unmistakable message of demotion. There would be no state funeral. There would be no lying in state. There would be no farewell column of dignitaries. The ceremony was closed, only close relatives permitted inside the cemetery walls. This is not how a nation buries even its disgraced leaders, unless it is afraid of what they might represent in death. The Soviet Union had experience with this particular fear. It had exercised it before, and it would exercise it again. The manner of a burial is a political statement. An official state funeral says, "This person served the system, and the system acknowledges them." The burial Khrushchev received said something else entirely. It said, "This person was a problem, and we're resolving the problem as quietly as possible." But problems in history have a way of refusing resolution. The question that haunts every subsequent chapter of this story is not simply how Khrushchev died, or even whether his death was as natural as the official record claims. The deeper question is what had happened in the years and months leading up to that September night that had elevated a retired, monitored, powerless old man to the status of active state threat. What had he done, or what had he been doing, that made the most powerful security apparatus in the world treat his passing like an emergency to be managed rather than a death to be mourned? The answer had been unspooling for months on magnetic tape in a quiet room at a dacha outside Moscow, in the voice of a man who had decided that silence was no longer something he was willing to offer to the system that had silenced him. Nikita Khrushchev had been talking for hours every day, for months, perhaps longer. He had been talking into a microphone, and the words coming out of him were not the safe, curated memories of a loyal communist pensioner reflecting fondly on his years of service. They were confessions, revelations, the interior architecture of the Soviet state laid open from the inside by the one man who had seen all of it and survived long enough to describe what he had seen. He was dictating his memoirs, and the Kremlin knew. Gerald Schechter, the Time magazine Moscow bureau chief who would later describe his role in the remarkable transmission of those tapes to the West, wrote of the sensation that greeted their eventual publication. A book produced from 180 hours of audio recordings, the first account by a Soviet leader to expose the inner workings of the Kremlin from the inside. The authenticity of the recordings had been verified by voice printing technology, matching Khrushchev's voice to recordings made at the United Nations. What was on those tapes could not be dismissed, could not be explained away, could only be denied. And denial, as the Soviet leadership would discover, is not the same thing as erasure. But in September of 1971, the tapes had not yet reached the West in their full form. They were still, in a sense, in play, still potentially retrievable, still a problem that the KGB believed it could solve. The men in gray coats at Novodevichy Cemetery that night were not guarding a grave. They were guarding a secret, and the secret had already escaped. Not the courage of a soldier who charges forward because he is young and cannot yet fully imagine his own death. Not the courage of a revolutionary who acts because he believes, with the certainty of youth, that history is on his side. The courage of the very old is something quieter and more terrible. It is the courage of a man who has nothing left to lose, who has outlived his ambitions and his enemies and his own reputation, and who decides in the narrow remaining corridor of his days that the truth is worth more than the silence he's been selling for years. This is the courage that Nikita Khrushchev found sometime in the autumn of 1964, in the weeks after his removal from power, sitting in a government dacha in the village of Petrovo-Dalny on the outskirts of Moscow, surrounded by KGB surveillance and the particular stillness of a man who has been made into a ghost before his body had the decency to comply. He was 70 years old. He was finished, politically and officially and completely. And he decided to start talking. The recordings began as a way of keeping himself sane. This much his son Sergei would later confirm. A man accustomed to commanding rooms, redirecting the course of nations, overwhelming subordinates with the sheer force of his personality and his voice, suddenly reduced to walking in a monitored garden and watching state television that never mentioned his name. The silence of forced retirement is its own kind of violence for a man like Khrushchev, and dictation was the antidote he found. Hours of his own voice filling a room, asserting his own existence against the erasure the Soviet state was patiently imposing on him. But what began as a private exercise in self-preservation grew into something far larger and far more dangerous, because Khrushchev remembered everything. He remembered the years of Stalin, not as the sanitized Soviet narrative described them, but as a man who had been inside them, who had attended the late-night dinners at Stalin's dacha, where the dictator would drink and test his subordinates and make decisions that cost millions of lives over the course of a meal. He remembered the terror not as an abstraction but as a personal experience, and more than that, as a personal participation. He had signed documents, he had approved lists. He had been in the precise bureaucratic language that the system preferred complicit, and now, into his microphone, he spoke about it with an honesty that no Soviet official had ever permitted themselves in any document intended to survive. He remembered the death of Stalin, the actual interior sequence of events in March of 1953, the strange paralysis of the leaders gathered around their dying master, the fear mixed with relief, the immediate scramble for position that began, according to Khrushchev, before the body was cold. He described the power struggle that followed, the arrest and execution of Beria, the careful maneuvering, the alliances made and broken in the space of weeks. None of this was in the official record. All of it was on the tapes. He remembered Cuba. This, above all else, was what kept Yuri Andropov awake at night. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, 13 days during which the world had genuinely been closer to nuclear annihilation than at any point before or since, was, from the Soviet perspective, a story that the Kremlin had very carefully managed for nearly a decade. The official version cast Moscow as a measured, responsible actor, responding proportionately to American provocations. Khrushchev's version, as it emerged onto the magnetic tape in his dacha study, was considerably more complicated and considerably more human. He described Fidel Castro's state of mind during the crisis with a frankness that astonished later historians. Castro had, according to Khrushchev, been prepared to accept nuclear war as a political outcome, and the Soviet leader had found himself in the strange position of restraining a revolutionary ally from dragging the world into annihilation. He described the secret communications with the Kennedy administration, the back-channel negotiations that never made it into any official transcript, the terrifying uncertainty of a process in which two men on opposite sides of the planet were trying to prevent their own military establishments from triggering a catastrophe neither wanted. He remembered Hungary in 1956 and what his own role had been in the decision to send Soviet tanks into Budapest to crush the uprising. He described it not with pride, not with the wooden self-justification of an official report, but with something that in another context might have been called regret. He remembered the internal history of the Communist Party, the factions, the betrayals, the personal hatreds that lay beneath the surface of collective leadership like fault lines beneath a city that believed itself safe. He named names. He described meetings that had never been acknowledged. He reconstructed conversations that the participants had assumed were buried with the circumstances. By the spring of 1971, he had recorded more than 800,000 words. The tapes ran for hundreds of hours, and they were, by this point, a secret that was already half broken. Yuri Andropov, chairman of the KGB, the most professional intelligence mind the Soviet system had produced since Beria, and a man who would one day briefly lead the country himself, had been monitoring the situation for years. His agents had documented the recording sessions, had noted the volume of material being produced, had attempted to assess what specifically Khrushchev was saying behind the doors of his study. The surveillance apparatus around Petrovo-Dalny was comprehensive. Telephone lines monitored, visitors logged, domestic staff reporting regularly on the old man's habits and moods and the frequency of his dictation sessions. But the KGB had a problem that was structural rather than operational. Khrushchev had not committed a crime they could name. He was dictating his memoirs, an activity that was technically not prohibited. He was an old man talking to a microphone in a room. The only crime was the content of what he said, and prosecuting him for that content would require acknowledging the content, which would require acknowledging that the content was accurate, which was precisely what the system could not do. The Kremlin was trapped in a paradox of its own construction. It could not arrest Khrushchev for telling the truth without admitting that the truth was what he was telling. And so instead they attempted persuasion. The first approach was fraternal and almost gentle, in the way that a threat delivered by a very powerful man to a very isolated one can still be described as gentle. Representatives came to the dacha, party officials, not KGB agents, at least not in official capacity, and explained to Khrushchev that his memoirs were causing concern, that the material he was discussing touched on matters of state security, that certain individuals still living would be damaged by revelations about their past, that it would be in everyone's interest, including his own family's, if he were to pause, reflect, perhaps reconsider the scope of what he was recording. Khrushchev listened to these arguments with the patience of a man who had spent his career making similar arguments to other people and understood exactly how they worked. Then he went back to his microphone. The second approach was more direct. In July of 1970, while Khrushchev was briefly hospitalized, a preliminary cardiac episode, the doctor said, KGB agents entered the dacha and confiscated the original tapes. It was a decisive operation, precisely planned and efficiently executed, and it solved nothing. Because the KGB, for all its efficiency, had made an assumption that turned out to be fatal. They had assumed that Khrushchev was keeping only one copy. He was not. His son Sergei had been methodically duplicating the recordings, and portions of the material had already been passed through a chain of intermediaries that involved trusted contacts in Moscow's intellectual community toward the West. The operation the Americans would later call the Jones Project, the careful, dangerous process of extracting Khrushchev's testimony from the Soviet Union, was already in motion before the KGB raided the dacha. The tapes confiscated in July of 1970 were not the only tapes. They were not even, in terms of the most sensitive material, the most dangerous tapes. Andropov received this intelligence and immediately elevated his assessment to Brezhnev. The threat was no longer theoretical. The material was in motion. Stopping it entirely would require stopping the man, and the man was still alive, still recording, and this was the detail that made the situation acute, actively seeking a mechanism for publication in the West. Brezhnev absorbed this information with the heavy, deliberate manner characteristic of a man whose political survival had always depended more on patience and coalition building than on speed. He had not hated Khrushchev personally. The ouster of 1964 had been business, not passion. But the memoirist Khrushchev, the Khrushchev who was dictating the interior history of the Soviet state onto magnetic tape and smuggling it out through dissident networks and Western journalists, represented something that Brezhnev understood viscerally, a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of the system over which he presided. The Soviet Union's authority rested in the final analysis, not on democratic consent or economic performance, but on narrative control. The party was infallible because the party said it was. The past was what the party said it had been. History was not a record, but a resource, shaped, edited, deployed in service of present political requirements. Khrushchev, with his 800,000 words of unfiltered recollection, was not merely writing a book. He was demolishing the epistemological foundation on which the entire edifice stood. He had to be contained. By the late summer of 1971, the conversations between Andropov and Brezhnev had moved beyond persuasion and beyond archive raids. The CIA's own assessment, circulated in its weekly summary of December 1970, had already identified the political stakes of the Khrushchev memoirs with precise analytical clarity. The material had returned to the limelight after 6 years, the figure of the quirky, dynamic former leader, and with it the Soviet leadership's problem of Stalin's image. Washington understood that the tapes were explosive. Moscow understood it too. The first volume of Khrushchev Remembers had been published by Little, Brown in late December of 1970. A sensation in the West, an emergency in the East. The Soviet government had immediately declared it a fabrication, a CIA provocation, a collection of forgeries assembled to discredit the Soviet Union. But the voice print analysis was unambiguous, and the specific, intimate, accurate details of Kremlin procedure contained in the text were not the kind of details that fabricators invent. The denials were noted and dismissed. The book sold in enormous numbers. Diplomats and tourists began carrying it into the USSR. And Khrushchev, back in his dacha, was still recording. The question that consumed Andropov in the summer and early autumn of 1971 was not whether the memoirs existed. They demonstrably did. It was not whether they would cause damage. They demonstrably would. The question was simpler and more terrible. How much more was there? How many more hours of tape? How many more names? How many more secrets? How many more moments in which the old man's extraordinary memory reached back into the locked rooms of Soviet history and illuminated what was there with devastating, unfiltered clarity? The answer, as Andropov's analysts calculated it, was more than enough. September of 1971 arrived with the particular crispness of a Moscow autumn, the kind of clear, cold weather that makes the city look almost beautiful. In his dacha at Petrovo-Dalnaya, Khrushchev sat before his microphone and recorded the final sessions. His voice, according to those who heard the tapes, had regained the vigor it had lost during the cardiac episode of the previous year. He sounded, witnesses said, like a man who had decided something. He had. He had completed what he considered the essential core of his testimony. He had spoken the names that needed speaking. He had described the events that needed describing. He had, in the vocabulary of a man who had grown up in a culture where testimony before death carried moral weight, said what he needed to say before the silence came. The silence came faster than he expected. On the morning of September 11, 1971, by all accounts available to historians, Khrushchev was in reasonable spirits. By evening, he was in crisis. By the following morning, he was gone. In Moscow, the phones were already ringing. There's a clock on the wall of every crisis room in every government that has ever existed, and its function is not to measure time, but to measure vulnerability. How many hours until the story escapes? How many hours until the phones begin ringing with questions that cannot be answered? How many hours between the moment a problem becomes a problem and the moment it becomes something that cannot be controlled? On the evening of September 11, 1971, that clock was running in Moscow. Nikita Khrushchev had died at approximately noon in a hospital room in Moscow's Central Clinical Hospital, attended by medical staff and surrounded by the institutional beige of Soviet state medicine. His family kept at a deliberate distance during the critical final hours. By evening, the information had traveled through the channels designed for exactly this kind of transmission. Not public channels, not the press wires that foreign correspondents monitored for any flicker of Soviet news, but the internal arterial system of the Soviet state. the direct lines that connected hospital administration to party officials to central committee staff to the men who occupied the highest offices in the land. And so, while Moscow continued its ordinary evening, workers returning from factories, families gathering around television sets broadcasting the state-approved programming that made no mention of anything unusual, children finishing their schoolwork in apartments that had no idea what had just ended. In the Kremlin, the lights were on, and the men who ran the country were not grieving. They were working. The emergency session of the Politburo convened that night was not announced, was not recorded in any publicly accessible document for decades, and was not, in the language of Soviet bureaucratic euphemism, described as an emergency session at all. But the accounts that have emerged through the gradual, partial, deeply contested process of post-Soviet archival opening describe a room of men focused not on the loss of a historical figure, but on the management of an information crisis of the first order. Yuri Andropov spoke first and longest. He had prepared. A KGB chairman of Andropov's caliber did not arrive at emergency Politburo sessions without preparation. That was, in fact, precisely what distinguished him from lesser operators in the Soviet system. He had spent years watching Khrushchev, monitoring the dacha, cataloging the recordings, assessing the threat with the methodical precision of a man who understood that in the intelligence world, the difference between a managed crisis and an unmanaged one was almost always the difference between preparation and improvisation. What Andropov placed before the Politburo that night was not a eulogy. It was an inventory of damage. More than 100 hours of recorded tape existed in various forms and in various locations. The original recordings had been partially confiscated in the operation of the previous year, but copies had been made. This much the KGB had confirmed through its surveillance of Sergei Khrushchev and through the intercepted communications of the intermediaries who had been involved in the transmission of material to the West. The first volume of the Memoirs had already been published in December of 1970 by the American publisher Little, Brown and Company under the title Khrushchev Remembers. The damage from that publication was already done and could not be undone. The Soviet state had denounced it as fabrication, and the denunciation had been largely ignored by everyone who read the book because the book was obviously not fabricated. But the first volume was only the first volume. What Andropov understood and what he communicated to the assembled Politburo members with the measured urgency of a man who has been living with a problem for years and has finally been given permission to solve it, was that the material remaining in play, the material not yet published, not yet transmitted, potentially still recoverable, was in some respects more dangerous than what had already reached the West. The later recordings covered events and personalities that the first volume had only touched on. They contained assessments of men currently sitting in senior positions in the Soviet government. They contained operational details of decisions that, if made public, would embarrass the Soviet Union in its ongoing competitions and negotiations with the Western powers. They contained, and this was the item Andropov delivered with the particular emphasis of a man dropping a stone into still water, Khrushchev's account of the events surrounding Stalin's death and his own interpretation of which individuals had known what and when. Several people in that room had reasons to prefer that particular chapter remain unwritten, or at least unpublished. Brezhnev listened to Andropov's presentation with the heavy, slightly unfocused patience that had become more pronounced in him as the years of his leadership accumulated. He was not, by 1971, the vigorous political operator who had engineered Khrushchev's ouster 7 years earlier. The slow physical deterioration that would eventually make him a figure of dark comedy in Soviet political life had already begun. The careful management of his public appearances, the increasing reliance on prepared texts, the slight but noticeable drag in his speech. But on matters of political survival and information control, his instincts remained sharp, and what Andropov was describing activated those instincts fully. The question was not whether to act. The question was how, and how fast and how completely. Andropov presented what he described as a three-stage operational response. The first stage was informational, a total blackout of the death in the Soviet domestic press for the maximum permissible period, followed by an announcement calibrated to communicate absolute political insignificance. No tributes, no retrospectives, no historical assessment of Khrushchev's role in Soviet development. The TASS announcement, when it finally came, would be composed in language that conveyed the minimum possible acknowledgement, a death notice, not an obituary, stripped of the biographical depth that would invite Soviet citizens to think too carefully about what they had lost or what they had never been told. Foreign correspondents in Moscow had been monitoring Soviet radio all evening. The announcement came so late and so briefly that several major Western wire services initially reported it with the qualification that the reports were unconfirmed. The second stage was physical, the rapid organization of a private burial designed to preclude public gathering, public mourning, and the kind of spontaneous popular demonstration that the Soviet state feared above almost everything else. The cemetery would be designated and secured. Access would be controlled, the number of mourners would be limited to family and a strictly managed list of approved individuals. KGB agents in civilian clothing would be present throughout, photographing and documenting everyone who attended, monitoring conversations, ensuring that the graveside did not become a platform for anything that could be interpreted as political statement. The burial would occur quickly before the Western press could organize any significant coverage and before Soviet citizens could make the journey to Moscow to pay their respects. The third stage was archival, and it was in many ways the most consequential, a comprehensive operation to locate, confiscate, and secure everything that remained of Khrushchev's recorded and written work. The dacha at Petrovo-Dalnaya would be searched methodically. The family's residence in Moscow would be visited. Every known associate, every visitor logged by the surveillance teams over the preceding years would be contacted, and their possession of any material related to Khrushchev's memoirs or correspondence assessed. Documents, letters, diaries, and family photographs, anything that could serve as the raw material of a posthumous legend, would be removed. The family would be informed of their obligations in language clear enough that no one would misunderstand what the consequences of non-compliance would be. Before dawn, the operation was authorized and the teams were being assembled. What happened at the dacha at Petrovo-Dalnaya in the hours and days following Khrushchev's death has been described in fragments by family members who survived long enough to speak about it after the glasnost era loosened the grip of the system that had silenced them. Nina Petrovna, his widow, was questioned, not once but several times in the weeks following the burial, in conversations that had the external form of condolence visits and the internal structure of interrogations. The questions were consistent. Who had visited in the past year? Who had been given access to recording equipment? Who had handled tapes? Who had been in contact with foreign nationals or with individuals known to have connections to foreign press organizations? She answered carefully with the practiced circumspection of a woman who had spent her entire adult life navigating the Soviet system and understood precisely what the costs of the wrong answer might be. Sergei Khrushchev, the son who had been most directly involved in the production and protection of the memoirs, was placed under surveillance so close and so constant that it constituted a form of house arrest without the formal designation. His career, he was an engineer and academic, was made precarious in the deliberate, deniable way the Soviet system had perfected over decades. Not a formal termination, but a sudden absence of opportunities, a cooling of professional relationships, a series of coincidences that added up to a message no one ever said aloud. The message was, the memory of your father costs you something, and we will keep extracting that cost until you understand the arithmetic. This is one of the most revealing aspects of what historians would later call the Khrushchev suppression, not because it was exceptional, but because it was entirely mechanically ordinary. The Soviet state did not invent this method for Khrushchev's family. It had been using it for decades, across generations, against the families of purge victims and dissidents, and anyone else whose connection to a dangerous truth made them instruments through which the state could apply pressure. The innovation, if it can be called that, was applying it to the family of a former general secretary, to people who had themselves once been part of the innermost circle of Soviet power, who understood the system from the inside, and who now experienced, with intimate and terrible clarity, how the system treated those who were no longer useful. What the operation could not do, what no amount of confiscation and surveillance and family pressure could accomplish, was recover what had already been sent. The tapes that had reached the West were beyond the reach of any domestic operation. The chain of transmission, through Moscow's intellectual community, through trusted intermediaries, through a process that involved both the courage of individuals willing to risk their own safety and the professional infrastructure of Western intelligence interest, had already deposited copies of the most essential material in locations that the KGB could not access. Gerald Schechter and his collaborators had verified the recordings, translated the material, and begun the editorial process that would eventually produce the second and third volumes of the memoirs. The first volume was already on shelves in London and New York and Paris, and every other city where the Soviet state was an abstraction rather than a reality. And the Soviet state's loud, furious, detailed denunciation of that book had, in the perverse mathematics of censorship, done nothing but increase its readership. Andropov understood this. He had understood it from the beginning, and it was perhaps the deepest source of his frustration with the entire Khrushchev situation. That the man had, through a combination of personal courage and the structural impossibility of completely sealing a society as large and complex as the Soviet Union, succeeded in getting his testimony out into the world before the system could stop him. The operation running in the days after the funeral was not a victory. It was damage containment, the best the system could manage after the decisive moment had already passed. In the TASS announcement distributed on September 13th to Soviet and international media, in the clipped, affect-free language of an institution performing a bureaucratic duty, Khrushchev was described simply as a pensioner, former first secretary of the Communist Party, former chairman of the Council of Ministers, a man who had led the Soviet Union through some of the most consequential and dangerous years of the 20th century, who had ordered the denunciation of Stalin's terror in a speech that had shaken the foundations of the communist world, who had stood on the edge of nuclear war and stepped back, who had understood, perhaps better than anyone else who had held his office, both the possibilities and the catastrophic limitations of the system he had served. A pensioner. The word was not accidental. It was a designation, a final political verdict delivered in a single noun. This man was nothing. His life meant nothing that we choose to acknowledge. His death changes nothing that we choose to admit. But across the city, in apartments where radios were kept quietly tuned to frequencies the state did not control, in kitchens where people spoke in low voices about things they did not discuss at work, in the growing underground network of samizdat literature and self-published text that was slowly, unstoppably transforming Soviet intellectual life. The news of Khrushchev's death was received differently, not as nothing, as a warning, as a signal, as one more entry in the long, accumulating record that the system was keeping of its own crimes against the truth. The clock on the wall of the Kremlin's crisis room had run out. The operation was underway. And somewhere, in a safe house in a western city, a tape recorder was playing. The Roman emperors used damnatio memoriae, the formal condemnation of memory, the chiseling of names from stone, the melting of portraits from bronze, the destruction of every physical trace of the condemned so that posterity would find nothing to remember, and therefore nothing to revere. The methodology was total, and the intention was metaphysical, not merely to punish the living, but to retroactively uncreate the person, to edit them from the record of existence as if they had never been. The Soviet state had learned this lesson well. It had refined it, professionalized it, equipped it with modern bureaucratic machinery, and the full institutional weight of a security apparatus that employed more people than most nations deployed in their entire military. When the Kremlin decided that a person needed to be removed from history, it did not rely on chisels and smelting pots. It relied on the KGB, on party pressure, on the systematic suffocation of memory through the coordinated action of every institution the state controlled, which, in the Soviet Union, was every institution that existed. In the autumn of 1971, this machinery turned with all its considerable weight against the memory of a single old man. The operation had no official name, or if it did, that name has not surfaced in the documents that became accessible after the partial opening of Soviet archives under Gorbachev, and then more substantially after the Soviet collapse. But historians and investigative journalists who have examined the pattern of events in the weeks and months following Khrushchev's death have described it collectively as a suppression operation of unusual scope and duration. It was not an improvisation. It had the texture of a plan, something assembled in advance, at least partially, because the men running it had understood for years that this moment would eventually arrive and had prepared their response accordingly. The physical dimension of the operation began within hours of the death announcement. Teams from the KGB's 5th Directorate, the division responsible for internal ideological security, for monitoring intellectuals, artists, and anyone whose activities posed a threat to the Soviet narrative, were dispatched to Petrovo-Dalnaya and to the Khrushchev family's Moscow apartment on Starokonasheny Lane. What they were looking for was any material that could become the raw material of a public legend, written manuscripts, personal diaries, correspondence with foreign nationals or with Soviet intellectuals, known to have Western connections, family photographs that could be published abroad, any recording equipment or residual tapes not yet accounted for. What they found, according to accounts that emerged years later, was considerably less than they had hoped and considerably more than they had expected. Less because Sergei Khrushchev had anticipated exactly this kind of visit and had spent years making sure that the most critical material was not concentrated in any single location that the KGB could neutralize in one operation. More because the volume of material Khrushchev had produced in his years of enforced retirement was staggering. Not just the recorded memoirs, but letters, notes, marginal annotations on books, fragments of reflection that he had committed to paper in the way that old men sometimes do when they know they are running out of time and want to leave behind something more than silence. The letters were confiscated. The annotated books were removed. Personal photographs, particularly those showing Khrushchev in informal settings in moments of private humanity rather than official performance, were taken from frames, extracted from albums, systematically stripped from the domestic record of a family's life. What was left behind was a residence from which the central presence had been erased, not just by death, but by the physical removal of every artifact that might sustain his presence in memory. This is worth pausing on because it reveals something essential about how authoritarian power understands the relationship between objects and truth. The KGB agents who removed those photographs were not operating on the basis of a crude calculation about propaganda. They were operating on the basis of a sophisticated understanding of how memory works, that it attaches itself to physical things, that photographs and letters and handwritten notes are not merely representations of the past, but triggers for it, and that a family stripped of its material memory is a family whose ability to bear witness is proportionally diminished. They were not destroying evidence. They were dismantling the architecture of testimony. The pressure on the family was more sustained and more personal than the archive raids. Nina Petrovna, Khrushchev's widow, was a woman who had survived everything the Soviet 20th century had to offer. The terror years, the war, the political pressures of her husband's time at the summit of power, and then the long, grinding humiliation of his forced retirement. She was not easily frightened, but the visits she received in the weeks after the funeral were designed with a precision that went beyond ordinary intimidation. The men who came to see her were polite, invariably polite, in the way that only men who do not need to be impolite can afford to be. They expressed condolences. They inquired about her well-being. They asked careful questions about her husband's activities in his final years, questions that were framed as administrative necessities, as loose ends in the management of a deceased party member's affairs, but that were in their actual intent something considerably sharper. The underlying message, delivered through implication and atmosphere rather than explicit statement, was consistent. The interests of the family and the interests of the state were, at this juncture, best served by cooperation. Cooperation meant not speaking to foreign journalists, not communicating with foreign publishers or their intermediaries, not providing any additional material that might find its way into the ongoing publication project that the KGB knew was operating somewhere in the space between Moscow and New York, not confirming the authenticity of recordings that Soviet officials had publicly declared to be fabrications. Nina Petrovna cooperated. She had no real choice, and she understood this with the clarity of a woman who had been navigating Soviet power for most of her adult life. Cooperation in this context was not weakness or betrayal. It was survival strategy, the same survival strategy that millions of Soviet citizens had practiced across decades, the art of giving the system just enough of what it wanted to prevent it from taking everything. Sergei Khrushchev occupied a more complicated and more dangerous position. He was the son who had been closest to his father's project, the one who had participated in the recording sessions, who had understood from the beginning what his father was trying to do and why, and who had taken the personal risk of ensuring that the material survived the KGB's attempts to confiscate it. He was, by the state's assessment, the primary target of whatever pressure could be brought to bear on the family, because he was the one who knew the most and had done the most to undermine the suppression operation. The pressure came in the form of his career. Sergei Khrushchev was an aerospace engineer, a professional with genuine expertise employed in Soviet defense research and the kind of productive technical specialist the Soviet state simultaneously needed and feared. After his father's death, the management of his professional life became an exercise in deniable coercion. Promotions that had been expected did not materialize. Projects he had been assigned to were quietly redirected. Colleagues who had been friendly became carefully distant. The social temperature around him dropped by degrees that were individually explainable and collectively unmistakable. He was not fired. He was not arrested. He was simply made to understand, through the accumulated weight of 100 small discouragements, that his father's memory was a liability he was carrying into every room he entered, and that the cost of carrying it would continue to be extracted from him indefinitely. This is the method the Soviet system had perfected over decades, and it is worth naming it precisely. It is a form of collective punishment administered with such bureaucratic deniability that the victim has no specific grievance to articulate, no single act to identify and challenge, no clear moment at which the injustice can be confronted. The punishment is ambient. It is woven into the texture of ordinary professional life so thoroughly that it becomes indistinguishable from bad luck. And this is precisely its power. It is experienced by the target as persecution, but cannot be proven as persecution, which means it cannot be resisted as persecution. The intellectual and cultural community that had been quietly associated with Khrushchev's project received its own version of this treatment. The Moscow intelligentsia of the early 1970s was already living under significant pressure. The Brezhnev era had, from its very first years, been methodically reversing the relative openness of the Khrushchev period, tightening the constraints on what could be published, performed, exhibited, or said in any form that might reach an audience. The circle of individuals who had known about the Memoir project, or who had been involved in any way in the chain of transmission that had moved copies of the tapes toward the West, found themselves subjected to heightened scrutiny of a kind that was, again, individually deniable but collectively systematic. Manuscripts were delayed at editorial boards. Exhibition applications encountered procedural obstacles. Foreign travel permissions, already difficult, became essentially impossible. The KGB did not need to arrest these people to control them. It simply needed to make the costs of association with anything related to Khrushchev's legacy sufficiently high that self-censorship accomplished what formal prohibition might not. And yet, the operation failed in the way that all operations designed to suppress truth eventually fail, which is to say it succeeded in the short term and collapsed over the longer arc. The tapes were already in the West. The Jones Project, the American operation to receive and process the smuggled recordings, had extracted enough material before the post-death crackdown that the publication effort could continue on the basis of what had already been secured. The second volume of Khrushchev Remembers, covering the period of his leadership and including material on Cuba, Hungary, and the internal power struggles of the Kremlin, would be published in 1974, 3 years after his death, despite everything the KGB had attempted in the intervening period. A third volume, drawing on the final recordings, would follow years later. The denunciations the Soviet state issued at each publication were louder, more elaborate, and less convincing than the one that had preceded them. By the time the second volume appeared, the academic and intelligence communities in the West had subjected the first volume to enough textual and contextual analysis to be confident of its authenticity, and the Soviet denials had the character of a defendant protesting innocence by becoming progressively more agitated rather than progressively more persuasive. Brezhnev, according to accounts that emerged much later, was personally consumed by the memoir situation in a way that his official composure concealed, but his private behavior revealed. He had summoned Khrushchev to the Central Committee headquarters before the death. An awkward, unproductive confrontation in which the former leader sat across from his successor with the unruffled patience of a man who knew exactly what was being asked of him and had already decided not to provide it. Brezhnev, according to Sergei Khrushchev's account, could not bring himself to make the direct request. Out of the complex mixture of resentment, insecurity, and perhaps a residual awareness of who this man had been, he circled the subject without landing on it, and Khrushchev left without having committed to anything. It was not Brezhnev's most effective performance. What the operation ultimately revealed, and what its failure made more visible rather than less, was the fundamental epistemological crisis at the heart of the Soviet state. The system rested on the claim that it controlled reality, that the official version of events was not merely the authorized version, but the true one, that the party's account of history was history itself. Khrushchev's memoirs were dangerous not primarily because of any specific revelation they contained, though the specific revelations were damaging enough, but because of what their very existence demonstrated, that the official version was a version, one account among possible others, and that a man who had been inside the machine could sit down with a microphone and produce an entirely different account that was recognizably and demonstrably real. This was the crack in the foundation, not a political scandal, not a foreign policy failure, not an economic shortcoming, but a crack in the basic epistemic authority of the state itself. The Soviet Union claimed not just to govern its citizens, but to define reality for them. Khrushchev had demonstrated that reality could be reclaimed, described, transmitted, and published, and that the system, for all its surveillance and confiscation and family pressure and career destruction, could not ultimately prevent this from happening. The men in gray coats photographing mourners at Novodevichy Cemetery on the night of the burial had understood this at some level without being able to articulate it. They were not just guarding a grave, they were guarding an admission. The admission that the state's fear of one old man's voice was greater than its confidence in its own version of the truth. And in that admission lay the beginning of everything that followed. There is a moment in every great intelligence operation when the mechanism becomes irreversible. When enough pieces have been moved, enough channels established, enough copies made in enough different locations, that no countervailing force, however powerful, can put the original back together. In the story of Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs, that moment came not in a government building, not in a secure facility of any intelligence agency, but in the living room of a Moscow dacha, where a man named Victor Louis played a few minutes of tape for an American journalist and watched the journalist's expression change. The voice was unmistakable. Gerald Schechter was the Time magazine bureau chief in Moscow in the late 1960s, a journalist with the specific skill set that the Cold War demanded of anyone operating at the intersection of Western media and Soviet reality. Patience, discretion, the ability to maintain relationships across the ideological divide without either betraying the relationships or compromising the journalism, and the instinct to recognize when he was in the presence of something historically significant. Victor Louis was one of the most enigmatic figures in the Moscow of that era, a Soviet journalist with Western contacts who operated in the ambiguous space between accredited correspondent and intelligence asset, a man whose precise affiliations were never entirely clear, and whose usefulness to multiple parties was precisely the source of his value to all of them. Louis had come to Schechter with a proposition that required careful evaluation before it could be accepted, let alone acted upon. He had access, he said, to recorded memoirs, hours of tape dictated by Nikita Khrushchev himself at his dacha outside Moscow, covering his entire career, naming names, describing events, providing from the inside the account of Soviet history that no Soviet publication would ever be permitted to carry. The material was genuine, the source was indisputable, and it needed to find its way into print before the KGB found a way to pre. There is a moment in every great intelligence operation when the mechanism becomes irreversible, when enough pieces have been moved, enough channels established, enough copies made in enough different locations that no countervailing force, however powerful, can put the original back together. In the story of Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs, that moment came not in a government building, not in a secure facility of any intelligence agency, but in the living room of a Moscow dacha, where a man named Victor Louis played a few minutes of tape for an American journalist and watched the journalist's expression change. The voice was unmistakable. Gerald Schechter was the Time magazine bureau chief in Moscow in the late 1960s, a journalist with the specific skill set that the Cold War demanded of anyone operating at the intersection of Western media and Soviet reality. Patience, discretion, the ability to maintain relationships across the ideological divide without either betraying the relationships or compromising the journalism, and the instinct to recognize when he was in the presence of something historically significant. Victor Louis was one of the most enigmatic figures in the Moscow of that era, a Soviet journalist with Western contacts who operated in the ambiguous space between accredited correspondent and intelligence asset, a man whose precise affiliations were never entirely clear, and whose usefulness to multiple parties was precisely the source of his value to all of them. Louis had come to Schechter with a proposition that required careful evaluation before it could be accepted, let alone acted upon. He had access, he said, to recorded memoirs, hours of tape dictated by Nikita Khrushchev himself at his dacha outside Moscow, covering his entire career, naming names, describing events, providing from the inside the account of Soviet history that no Soviet publication would ever be permitted to carry. The material was genuine, the source was indisputable, and it needed to find its way into print before the KGB found a way to prevent that from happening. Schechter's problem was authentication, and it was not a small problem. The Soviet state had an established record of disinformation operations, of producing forged documents, fabricated testimonies, and manufactured controversies designed to embarrass Western governments and undermine the credibility of anti-Soviet publications. If Time and Little, Brown published what they claimed were Khrushchev's memoirs, and it turned out the tapes were fabricated, the damage to the publication's credibility would be enormous, and the propaganda value to Moscow incalculable. The Soviet state would use the forgery as proof that all Western reporting on the USSR was manufactured, that the free press was indistinguishable from a CIA front, that nothing originating from behind the Iron Curtain and transmitted through Western channels could be trusted. Schechter needed proof that was technical, specific, and irrefutable. The solution he devised was elegant in its simplicity. He obtained two hats, unremarkable, ordinary hats. and asked Louis to arrange for photographs of Khrushchev wearing them. The hats were distinctive enough to be identifiable in a photograph, but ordinary enough that their transmission would not raise immediate alarm. If photographs appeared showing Khrushchev wearing the hats, it would constitute confirmation that the former Soviet leader was aware of and cooperating with the publication effort. That the memoirs were not a fabrication, but a deliberate act by the man himself. The photographs arrived. Nina Khrushcheva, his granddaughter, examined the hats and reportedly remarked that they were too bright for her grandfather's taste. But he wore them anyway, for the photograph, and the photograph made its way back to Schechter in Moscow. Confirmation that the special pensioner, as the KGB bureaucratically designated him, was in on the project. Confirmation that what would become Khrushchev Remembers was not an intelligence fabrication, but something considerably more extraordinary, a voluntary act of historical testimony by a man who had decided that the truth he carried was more important than the silence the state demanded of him. The voice print analysis completed the technical authentication. Time had the tapes analyzed by acoustic specialists who compared the recordings to Khrushchev's voice at his famous United Nations speech, the shoe-pounding performance of 1960 that remained one of the most distinctive audio documents of the Cold War. The match was unambiguous. Whatever else could be questioned about the memoirs, the voice on the tapes was indisputably the same voice that had told the United Nations that history would bury the West. On November 23, 1970, the Times of London began a 4-week serialization of the reminiscences. On the same day, the first installment appeared in Life magazine, and simultaneously in France, Soir, Der Stern, and 16 other periodicals across the world. The book itself, 275,000 words, published by Little, Brown and Company, appeared in bookstores in December of that year. The publisher's note confirmed with a directness unusual in publishing that the house was convinced beyond any doubt and had taken pains to confirm that this is an authentic record of Nikita Khrushchev's words. The reaction in Moscow was instantaneous and revealing. Arvid Pelche, the chairman of the Party Control Commission and one of the more ideologically rigid members of the Politburo, summoned Khrushchev to account for himself. The confrontation that followed was, by any measure, one of the more remarkable scenes in the late history of the Soviet state. A retired leader, stripped of every title and privilege, sitting across from his party's disciplinary authority and being required to explain himself as if he were a junior functionary caught with unauthorized documents. Khrushchev listened to the accusations and then told Pelche, with the technical precision of a man who had spent his entire career navigating the Soviet system's relationship with language, that he had never turned over his memoirs to anyone. This was, strictly speaking, accurate. He had not turned them over. He had dictated them and allowed them to be copied and permitted their transmission through intermediaries and consented to their publication. But the specific phrase Pelche used gave Khrushchev just enough grammatical space to issue a denial that was simultaneously true and completely misleading. The resulting TSS statement, in which Khrushchev was quoted denying that he had provided his memoirs for Western publication, was itself a historical curiosity. It was the first time since his removal from power in 1964 that his name had appeared in Soviet print at all. The effort to suppress him had produced the very acknowledgement it was designed to prevent. The Soviet official denunciation of Khrushchev Remembers as a CIA fabrication was comprehensive, sustained, and ultimately self-defeating. The more emphatically Moscow insisted the book was a forgery, the more credible it became to Western readers, who understood that governments do not deploy the full weight of their propaganda apparatus against books that are actually fictional. Real fabrications can be ignored. Only the truth requires this level of official alarm. The book became an international phenomenon. It was reviewed in every major Western newspaper and journal. It was discussed in academic seminars and intelligence briefings and ordinary dinner conversations among people who followed Soviet affairs. It was translated and republished and quoted and analyzed. And then, through channels that the Soviet state monitored with increasing desperation and decreasing effectiveness, it began to seep back across the border it had been smuggled out of. The mechanism of return was multiple and mutually reinforcing. Diplomats and tourists carried physical copies into the Soviet Union, tucked into luggage that customs officials inspected with thoroughness but not omniscience. Samizdat networks, the informal, entirely illegal, entirely unstoppable system by which Soviet citizens reproduced and circulated prohibited texts, extracted the most incendiary passages, and distributed them in typed copies that traveled hand to hand through the intelligentsia of Moscow and Leningrad and Kiev and a dozen other cities. And then, most powerfully of all, Radio Liberty entered the picture. Beginning on January 7, 1974, Radio Liberty broadcast all 3 volumes of Khrushchev Remembers in 15-minute daily installments to Soviet audiences. For millions of listeners who had never had access to the physical book, who lived in cities and towns far from the Moscow intelligentsia networks, who had no diplomatic contacts and no access to samizdat, Radio Liberty's broadcasts were the first time they heard, in coherent and detailed form, an insider's account of what their government had actually done and who had actually done it. The broadcast described the terror years in the voice of a man who had participated in them. They described the Cuban Missile Crisis from the perspective of the Soviet leader who had initiated it and then stepped back from the edge. They described the internal culture of the Kremlin, the fear, the calculation, the mutual surveillance, the performance of ideology by people who had long since stopped believing in it, with an intimacy that no foreign correspondent could have manufactured. The Soviet jamming apparatus worked overtime. Transmitters across the western regions of the USSR broadcast electronic interference across the Radio Liberty frequencies, with the sustained effort of an institution that understood exactly what was at stake. But jamming's imperfect. It works unevenly across geography. It fails in atmospheric conditions that favor the signal over the noise. It cannot follow a listener who moves to a different location or adjusts equipment to find a clearer frequency. Millions of Soviet citizens sitting in apartments and cars and dachas with radios pressed close to their ears heard Khrushchev's voice reaching across the interference, heard him describe their history, heard him name names, heard him say, in the plain, colloquial Russian of a man from a Ukrainian mining village who had risen to lead a superpower, what had actually happened. And what they heard began to work on them in the way that truth, once genuinely encountered, tends to work. Slowly, incompletely, with long pauses and setbacks, but irreversibly. The second volume of Khrushchev Remembers appeared in 1974, 3 years after his death, containing material drawn from the later recordings that had been transmitted before and during the post-death crackdown. The third volume, the Glasnost tapes, would not appear until 1990, by which point the Soviet Union was in the advanced stages of a dissolution that had many causes and many catalysts. But among the intellectual and cultural conditions that made the Soviet collapse possible, that created the generation of Soviet citizens who were ready, when the moment came, to stop defending a system they had privately understood to be built on fabrications. The Khrushchev Memoirs occupy a specific and irreplaceable position. Schechter, reflecting on his role in the operation decades later, described what he had taken away from the 3 volumes of memoirs as a simple but devastating insight: that Khrushchev had played an instrumental role in destroying Soviet communism with his revelations. Not accidentally, not as a side effect of some other intention, but deliberately, with the specific understanding that the system he had served and led and eventually been destroyed by could only be confronted through the testimony of those who had been inside it. The outsider's critique of Soviet power, however accurate, could always be dismissed as ideological hostility. The insider's testimony could not be dismissed in the same way. It carried a different kind of authority, the authority of a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to gain and was speaking in the time remaining to him simply because the silence had cost too much for too long. The Jones Project, the American operation that had received, authenticated, and transmitted the tapes, remained classified for years, its precise mechanics unavailable to the public record. But its results were visible to anyone who paid attention to the trajectory of Soviet intellectual life across the 1970s and 80s. A slow spreading awareness transmitted through samizdat and radio broadcasts and passed hand copies of a book the state insisted did not exist, that the official version of Soviet history was a construction, that there were people who knew this and had said so, and that the truth, however long it had been suppressed, had found its way into the world and could not be called back. The Kremlin had feared exactly this. They had been right to fear it. The book that began as an old man talking into a German-made Uher recorder in a monitored dacha outside Moscow had become, by the time Radio Liberty finished broadcasting it in 1974, something that no intelligence operation and no suppression campaign had managed to prevent. A document of record, a testimony in the historical sense of the word, a voice from inside the machine that the machine could denounce but could not silence. And somewhere in the accumulating record of everything the Soviet state had done to stop that voice from being heard, the confiscations, the family pressure, the career destruction, the denunciations, the jamming transmitters, the gray-coated men at a graveyard in Moscow, lay the most honest self-portrait the system ever produced. It had been terrified of one old man with a tape recorder, and the terror had been entirely justified. History has a patience that governments do not. Governments operate on the logic of the present tense, the urgent calculation of what must be hidden today to preserve the power structure tomorrow. They confiscate documents and pressure witnesses and issue denials and jam radio frequencies. And for a time, sometimes a very long time, they succeed. The gap between what happened and what the official record admits to is maintained by force and institutional inertia and the simple biological fact that the witnesses who remember the unrevised truth are mortal, and mortality has always been the state's most reliable ally. But the documents survive longer than the governments that produce them. The files outlast the filing systems. The records of what was done accumulate in basements and restricted archives, and the private memories of aging officials. And when the institutional force maintaining the silence finally weakens, through reform or collapse or the slow erosion of a system that spent too long defending too many lies, the truth does not disappear with the system that suppressed it. It surfaces. Imperfectly, incompletely, with fragments missing and edges burned away, but it surfaces. In the Soviet Union, that surfacing began in earnest in 1986, when Mikhail Gorbachev stood before the 27th Party Congress and used a word that his predecessors had treated as a controlled substance, glasnost. Openness, not complete openness. The Soviet system was constitutionally incapable of complete openness, even in its most reformist phase. But a calibrated, strategic relaxation of the pressure that had kept the official version of Soviet history sealed against the pressure of reality for 7 decades. The archives began, slowly and selectively, to release what they contained. What they contained, in the case of Nikita Khrushchev, was more than the Kremlin had planned to give. History has a patience that governments do not. Governments operate on the logic of the present tense, the urgent calculation of what must be hidden today to preserve the power structure of tomorrow. They confiscate documents and pressure witnesses and issue denials and jam radio frequencies, and for a time, sometimes a very long time, they succeed. The gap between what happened and what the official record admits to is maintained by force and institutional inertia, and the simple biological fact that the witnesses who remember the unrevised truth are mortal, and mortality has always been the state's most reliable ally. But the documents survive longer than the governments that produce them. The files outlast the filing systems. The records of what was done accumulate in basements and restricted archives, and the private memories of aging officials. And when the institutional force maintaining the silence finally weakens, through reform or collapse or the slow erosion of a system that spent too long defending too many lies, The truth does not disappear with the system that suppressed it. It surfaces, imperfectly, incompletely, with fragments missing and edges burned away. But it surfaces. In the Soviet Union, that surfacing began in earnest in 1986, when Mikhail Gorbachev stood before the 27th Party Congress and used a word that his predecessors had treated as a controlled substance: glasnost, openness. Not complete openness. The Soviet system was constitutionally incapable of complete openness, even in its most reformist phase, but a calibrated strategic relaxation of the pressure that had kept the official version of Soviet history sealed against the pressure of reality for 7 decades. The archives began, slowly and selectively, to release what they contained. What they contained, in the case of Nikita Khrushchev, was more than the Kremlin had planned to give back. The first significant revelation was structural rather than evidentiary. Researchers who gained access to the Central Committee protocols of September 1971 found documentation confirming what the pattern of events had always suggested but could not formally establish: that the Politburo had convened an emergency session in the hours following Khrushchev's death, and that the agenda of that session had concerned not grief management or historical commemoration, but information control. The minutes of this session, such as they were, Soviet Politburo minutes, were notoriously sparse on the kind of specific detail that would have been most revealing. Confirmed the 3-stage suppression operation: media blackout, rapid private burial, comprehensive archival confiscation. The decision had been taken collectively, with Brezhnev presiding and Andropov presenting. The institutional record of the Soviet state had, in its own bureaucratic language, documented its own panic. But it was the medical record that proved most haunting and most incomplete. Among the documents that became partially accessible in the glasnost era and its aftermath were notes attributed to physicians who had been present during Khrushchev's final hours. The accounts were fragmentary, heavily redacted in the versions that reached researchers, and came embedded in the broader medical bureaucracy of the Soviet healthcare system in ways that made their provenance difficult to establish with complete certainty. But within those fragments were clinical observations that specialists who examined them found difficult to reconcile with an ordinary cardiac event. The progression was too fast, the deterioration from a morning described as relatively stable. A man who had walked in his garden, eaten breakfast, spoken coherently with household staff, to full cardiovascular collapse by evening was steep in a way that one cardiologist, who reviewed the available record, described privately as consistent with pharmacological intervention rather than natural progression. The refusal of the family's request for an autopsy, formally documented in the administrative record, removed the one mechanism that might have provided definitive forensic evidence in either direction. And the refusal had not been issued by a hospital administrator operating within normal medical protocol. It had come from a level of authority that did not typically involve itself in the disposition of a pensioner's remains. The KGB's Laboratory 12, the facility formerly known as the Camera, operated within the Soviet security apparatus from 1921 through to the Soviet collapse, had been developing poisons designed to simulate natural deaths for as long as the Soviet state had been executing its inconvenient citizens. The laboratory's specific mandate included the production of compounds that would induce cardiac symptoms without leaving the forensic signatures that standard autopsies would detect. By the 1970s, this program had been running for half a century, refining its methods through application in operations across Europe and within the Soviet Union itself. The CIA's own classified assessment of KGB assassination capabilities, portions of which were declassified in later years, stated with characteristic directness that the KGB preferred for high-profile domestic eliminations reliable, well-tested poisons that leave the appearance of a heart attack. The precedent was extensively documented. Ukrainian nationalist Stepan Bandera had been killed in Munich in 1959 using a cyanide spray weapon that caused instantaneous cardiac arrest, the death initially diagnosed as heart failure. Bulgarian dissident Georgy Markov had been killed in London in 1978 with a Reichsen pellet that produced symptoms mimicking natural illness. The weapon system was established, operational, and in the possession of the organization that had been monitoring Khrushchev's every movement for 7 years and had assessed his memoir project as an existential threat to the system they protected. The medical team that arrived at the dacha on the afternoon of September 11th, the unfamiliar faces from the special hospital that the family later described as people they had never seen before in connection with Khrushchev's regular medical care, has never been fully identified in the public record. Their names do not appear in the accessible documentation with any specificity that would permit independent verification. The chain of authorization that dispatched them, if such a chain existed in any written form, has not surfaced in any archive that has been open to researchers. This is not accidental. It is the specific shape of the absence that the KGB was trained to create. A nurse who had worked at the facility where Khrushchev spent his final hours gave an account years later describing a deterioration in his condition that correlated in timing that she found troubling even without the medical vocabulary to characterize it precisely. With the visit of individuals she did not recognize and whose presence in the ward had not followed the normal administrative process for specialist consultations. Her account was informal, partial, given in the context of a glasnost-era interview that the Soviet state no longer had the power to suppress, but also no longer had the obligation to investigate. It existed in the record as testimony rather than evidence, the kind of human account that historians treat as significant, but that legal standards of proof would find insufficient. And this is where the investigation reaches its terminus. Not a closed door, but an open question that the available evidence cannot resolve, and that the missing evidence was specifically designed to prevent from ever being resolved. The KGB's institutional professionalism in the matter of Khrushchev's death was, if the circumstantial case is accepted, precisely the problem. An organization that had spent decades perfecting the art of death that looked like natural deaths, that operated a dedicated laboratory for exactly this purpose, that had both the motive and the operational capability and the specific medical access required. Such an organization, if it acted, would have acted in a way that left precisely the evidentiary record that exists. Suggestive, troubling, internally consistent with suspicion, but nowhere conclusive. The absence of proof is not the proof of absence. It is the proof of competence. What Gorbachev's glasnost gave the world was not the answer to the question of how Khrushchev died. It gave the world the clearer understanding of why that question cannot be answered. Because the system that would have left the evidence was the same system that had the means and the motive and the institutional knowledge to ensure that no evidence would survive in a form that could be acted upon. The partial opening of the archives confirmed what thoughtful observers had suspected from the character of the funeral, that the Politburo had treated Khrushchev's death as a crisis to be managed rather than a loss to be mourned. It confirmed that a suppression operation of unusual scope had been authorized and executed in the days and weeks following the death. It confirmed that the KGB had possessed specific concerns about the memoir project that had reached the level of personal Andropov to Brezhnev reporting in the months before September of 1971. And it confirmed, through the medical fragments and the nurse's testimony and the refusal of autopsy, that the circumstances of the death itself were not as transparent as the TSS announcement had described. What it could not confirm, and what the destroyed documents, the missing medical records, the unidentified medical team, and the decades of institutional suppression were designed to make forever unconfirmable, was whether the heart attack that killed Nikita Khrushchev on September 11, 1971 was the kind of heart attack that happens to old men who have lived with cardiac problems for years, or the kind of heart attack that Laboratory 12 had spent 50 years learning to produce on demand. Sergei Khrushchev, who eventually emigrated to the United States and spent his later years at Brown University, where the Khrushchev collection is housed, reflected on his father's death with the particular combination of private certainty and public caution that characterized everyone who had lived inside the Soviet system and understood the difference between what could be proven and what was almost certainly true. He did not make formal accusations. He described the circumstances. He noted the anomalies. He allowed the pattern to speak in the way that patterns speak when the people who created them are counting on there being no one left who remembers how to read them. The Khrushchev collection at Brown University contains 180 hours of recorded tape, thousands of pages of transcribed and translated material, and the accumulated scholarly apparatus of decades of research by historians who have devoted careers to understanding what one man said into a microphone in a monitored dacha outside Moscow, and what it cost him to say it. The collection is accessible, the tapes can be listened to, the voice is there, the same voice that the acoustic specialists matched to the United Nations recordings, the same voice that Radio Liberty broadcast across the Soviet Union in 15-minute installments, the same voice that the Politburo convened an emergency session to contain. It was not contained. The Soviet Union that authorized the suppression operation in September of 1971 endured for exactly 20 more years. In December of 1991, the red flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time, and the state that had been so terrified of one old man's tape recorder ceased to exist as a political entity. The causes of that collapse were multiple and interlocking: economic stagnation, the failure of the Afghan intervention, the centrifugal force of nationalist movements in the republics, the reforms that Gorbachev intended as salvation, and that instead accelerated dissolution. But running beneath all of these structural causes was something that the Khrushchev Memoirs had helped to produce. A generation of Soviet citizens who had heard through samizdat and radio broadcasts and the conversations that the glasnost era finally permitted to happen in public, that the official version of their history was a performance, and that the performance had been maintained by people who knew it was a performance and had decided, for reasons of power and survival and institutional inertia, to keep the curtain up anyway. The Khrushchev Memoirs did not cause the Soviet collapse, but they created the epistemic condition for it. The spreading awareness transmitted across 15 years of illegal reproduction and radio broadcasts and past hand copies that the truth existed independently of what the state said it was, and that the system's insistence on its own version of reality was not evidence of the version's accuracy, but evidence of the system's fear. This is what the men in gray coats at Novodevichy Cemetery could not prevent, even as they photographed the mourners and noted every face and cataloged every person who came to stand at the edge of a grave on a cold September morning in 1971. They could control the ceremony. They could limit the attendance. They could strip the event of every attribute of honor and public significance. They could ensure that Soviet television said nothing and that Soviet newspapers printed 3 lines in a font barely large enough to read. What they could not do was control what happened in the silence after, in the space between the official version and the human understanding of what that version was concealing. In that space, the voice on the tapes continued to speak. It spoke in the apartments where samizdat copies were read aloud. It spoke through the static of jammed radio frequencies that millions of Soviet citizens pressed their ears against and strained to hear. It spoke in the conversations that people had, finally, when the system that had required their silence ran out of the energy to enforce it. Khrushchev had said in the last years of his life that truth was like a seed in the ground, that you could cover it and trample it, but that eventually it would grow. He had been right. He had been more right than he likely knew, sitting alone in his monitored dacha with his microphone and his memories, and the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided that the silence had already cost too much. The seed was in the ground. 20 years later, everything that had been planted there was growing in the open air.